In the spring of 1940, Winston Churchill sat alone in the war room beneath Dover Castle, surrounded by maps marked with red arrows converging on a single point. Outside, the sound of distant thunder rolled across the English Channel, but it was not a storm. It was the sound of German artillery pounding the beaches of France. He had been Prime Minister for exactly 16 days. Around him, the machinery of a desperate nation hummed and clicked. Telephone lines crackled with reports from the front. Shadows moved behind frosted glass. The entire British Expeditionary Force, the cream of the nation's army, was trapped on a narrow strip of sand with the sea at their backs and the Wehrmacht closing in. 300,000 men, an entire generation. And the German panzers were less than 10 miles away. He was Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, First Lord of the Treasury, Minister of Defense, and the man who had just inherited the greatest military disaster in British history. His name had been synonymous with failure after the Gallipoli catastrophe of 1915. Now, 25 years later, history was offering him a second chance to prove himself, or to fail spectacularly once more. And the decision he made in those smoke-filled rooms, his refusal to negotiate, and his commitment to an evacuation that military experts deemed impossible, would determine not just the fate of Britain, but the future of the free world. Before the story continues, a note on our mission. This narrative is a 100% fact-checked account based on hours of research into primary historical sources, including War Cabinet minutes held in the National Archives, declassified documents, Churchill's own memoirs, and first-hand accounts from military commanders who lived through the crisis. The images you are seeing are atmospheric. They are not a literal, moment-by-moment recreation of the narrative. Their sole purpose is to create a mood. Think of this as a historical audiobook with visual accompaniment. If you believe true stories are more powerful than fiction, please support our mission of telling them by liking and subscribing. Now, the story continues. Winston Churchill was born into privilege at Blenheim Palace in 1874. The grandson of a duke, the son of a brilliant but unstable politician. But privilege did not translate to success. He struggled in school, barely passed his exams, and entered the military only after failing the entrance examination to Sandhurst twice. Yet from these unpromising beginnings emerged a man who would redefine British leadership. Churchill made his reputation as a war correspondent in South Africa, escaped from a prisoner of war camp, and parlayed his celebrity into a seat in Parliament. By 30, he was already a rising political star. By 40, he had held multiple cabinet positions. But in 1915, as First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill orchestrated the Gallipoli campaign, an amphibious assault on Turkey that ended in catastrophic failure. 21,000 Allied soldiers died. Churchill was forced to resign in disgrace. He spent the next 2 decades wandering the political wilderness, brilliant but mistrusted, eloquent but isolated. The Prime Minister of Britain in 1940 led a war government unlike any in the nation's history. It was a coalition of bitter rivals, forced together by necessity. The War Cabinet consisted of just 5 men: Churchill himself, Neville Chamberlain, the former Prime Minister who had appeased Hitler and lost Norway, Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary who believed negotiation was still possible, and 2 Labour Party representatives, Clement Attlee and Arthur Greenwood, who brought the working class into the decision-making process. Every decision required consensus. Every strategy was debated, dissected, challenged. Churchill did not have absolute power. He had to persuade, cajole, and sometimes outmaneuver his colleagues. And in May 1940, with France collapsing and the British army trapped. Persuasion was all he had. A typical day for Churchill during the crisis began at 8 in the morning and did not end until 3 or 4 the next morning. He worked from his bed, surrounded by papers, dispatches, and cigar smoke. He took a bath at midday, sometimes conducting meetings while soaking in the tub. He ate enormous meals, drank whiskey, and napped in the afternoon. Then he worked through the night, dictating letters, writing speeches, telephoning generals. His staff was exhausted. His colleagues were exasperated. But Churchill's energy was relentless, and in those desperate weeks, relentlessness was what Britain needed. He moved between 10 Downing Street, the underground cabinet war rooms, and Dover Castle, where Admiral Bertram Ramsay coordinated the evacuation from tunnels carved into the chalk cliffs. The air was thick with tension, cigarette smoke, and the smell of fear. The battlefield Churchill faced was not one of open plains or distant colonies. It was the political minefield of Whitehall and the treacherous waters of the English Channel. In Parliament, a substantial faction of Conservative MPs still believed Churchill was too reckless, too aggressive, too prone to catastrophic mistakes like Gallipoli. The King himself had preferred Lord Halifax for Prime Minister. Across the Channel, the German Wehrmacht had just accomplished what no army had done in a century. They had broken the French lines, driven through the supposedly impenetrable Ardennes forest, and cut the Allied armies in two. The French government was collapsing into panic and recrimination. Belgium had just surrendered. And in the cabinet war rooms beneath London, the chiefs of staff were drafting reports with titles like British Strategy in a Certain Eventuality, which was polite bureaucratic language for what happens when France falls and Britain has to fight alone. The specific battlefield was a narrow pocket of land around the French port of Dunkirk, 10 miles wide, 3 miles deep, surrounded on 3 sides by German forces. It was not strategic high ground. It was not a fortress. It was a seaside resort town with a harbor, a long concrete mole extending into the sea, and gently shelving beaches where in peacetime families built sand castles. Now those beaches were crowded with exhausted, hungry, frightened soldiers, watching the horizon for rescue ships that might never come. The harbor was too shallow for large warships to dock safely. The beaches were under constant attack from German dive bombers, and the perimeter was shrinking by the hour as German artillery moved closer. This was not a place anyone wanted to fight. It was a place men went to die. The crisis began not on the beaches of Dunkirk, but 500 miles away in the forests of Luxembourg. On May 10, 1940, at dawn, German forces launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. 135 divisions, 7 armored corps, and 3,000 aircraft crashed through neutral borders and raced west. The French had prepared for a repetition of World War I, a grinding stalemate along fixed fortifications. Instead, they got blitzkrieg, lightning war. Panzer tanks commanded by brilliant tacticians like Heinz Guderian smashed through the Ardennes, a heavily forested region the French had deemed impassable for armor. Within 72 hours, German forces had crossed the Meuse River. Within a week, they had reached the English Channel, cutting the Allied armies in two. The British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian units, was trapped in a shrinking pocket with their backs to the sea. By May 24th, the situation was catastrophic. The port of Boulogne had fallen. The garrison at Calais was surrounded, fighting a desperate last stand to buy time for the main force. General John Gort, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, made the unilateral decision to retreat toward Dunkirk, the last port still in Allied hands. He did not ask permission from London. He did not consult with his French counterparts. He simply recognized the inevitable and ordered his men to fall back. Churchill and the War Cabinet learned of the retreat through fragmentary reports that arrived hours late, garbled by panic and confusion. The Germans had cut communication lines. Allied intelligence was operating blind. Nobody knew how many men were still alive, how many divisions were still intact, or how long the defensive perimeter around Dunkirk could hold. Military planners estimated, in their most optimistic projections, that perhaps 20,000 men might be evacuated before the Germans broke through. Perhaps 30,000 if they were extraordinarily lucky. The stakes were existential. If the British Expeditionary Force was captured or destroyed, Britain would lose not just an army, but its capacity to defend itself. The island had no meaningful ground forces left. The Home Guard consisted of old men with hunting rifles. Invasion would be a matter of when, not if. Churchill understood this with brutal clarity. He told his private secretary, "It will be a miracle if we get 50,000 men away." In public, he prepared the nation for disaster. In the War Cabinet, he faced something even more dangerous than the Wehrmacht: the prospect of negotiated surrender. On May 25th, as German forces tightened their grip on Dunkirk, Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, met secretly with Giuseppe Bastianini, the Italian ambassador. Italy was still neutral, and Halifax believed that Benito Mussolini could be persuaded to broker peace talks between Britain and Germany. Halifax presented this proposal to the War Cabinet the following day. His argument was coldly logical. France was collapsing. The British Army was trapped. America was isolationist and unwilling to help. Britain could not win the war alone. Therefore, Britain should explore whether Hitler would accept a negotiated peace that preserved British independence, even if it meant surrendering control of continental Europe and accepting German domination from Poland to Portugal. It was appeasement, but appeasement born of desperation and mathematics. The numbers did not lie. Britain was losing. Churchill listened to Halifax's proposal and felt the ground shift beneath him. He had been Prime Minister for 16 days. He had no mandate, no personal base of support in his own party, and no guarantee that his War Cabinet would back him if he refused to negotiate. Neville Chamberlain, the former Prime Minister and still leader of the Conservative Party, sat across the table, silent and brooding. Chamberlain's entire political legacy was built on avoiding war through negotiation. If Chamberlain sided with Halifax, Churchill would be finished. Attlee and Greenwood, the Labour representatives, were instinctively anti-fascist, but they were new to government and wary of opposing the Conservative establishment. Churchill understood that this was not a debate about military strategy. It was a test of will. If he flinched, if he agreed to even explore peace terms, the momentum would become irreversible. Britain would slide from negotiation to capitulation, and everything he had spent his political life defending would be lost. The War Cabinet met 3 times on May 27th. The first meeting began at 11:30 in the morning and lasted for hours. The minutes, preserved in the National Archives, spanned 28 pages, the longest record of any War Cabinet session during the entire crisis. Halifax presented his memorandum formally, titled, "Suggested Approaches to Italy." His argument was careful, methodical, and superficially reasonable. If Mussolini could be persuaded to mediate, Perhaps Hitler could be persuaded to offer terms that preserved British sovereignty. Perhaps Germany would be satisfied with dominance in Europe and leave the British Empire intact. Perhaps negotiations would buy time for Britain to rearm. Perhaps. Churchill's response was immediate and uncompromising. He told the cabinet that peace and security achieved under German domination of Europe was unacceptable. Britain must ensure complete liberty and independence. Any negotiation that might lead to a derogation of British rights and power would be opposed. His voice was steady, but those who knew him recognized the fury beneath the surface. Halifax pushed back. He argued that Churchill was being unrealistic, that refusing to explore options was irrational, that Britain had a responsibility to consider all alternatives before committing to a war it could not win. The debate spiraled through the afternoon. Chamberlain, critically, remained silent for long stretches, clearly torn between his instinct for negotiation and his recognition that Hitler could not be trusted. The second War Cabinet meeting began at 4:30 that afternoon. Churchill, sensing that he was losing ground, made a tactical decision that would change everything. He invited Archibald Sinclair, the Liberal Party leader and Secretary of State for Air, to join the discussion. Sinclair was not a member of the War Cabinet, but Churchill needed another voice in the room, another vote against Halifax's proposal. The discussion resumed, and Halifax pressed harder. He revealed that the Italian embassy had made a formal approach, offering Mussolini's services as a mediator. Halifax argued that Britain must respond, must engage, must show willingness to consider all options. Churchill countered that entering into negotiations would be a fatal mistake, that once Britain began talking about peace terms, the psychological momentum would shift irreversibly, and Hitler would sense weakness and demand more, and more, until Britain had nothing left to bargain with. At 6:15 that evening, Churchill made his gambit. He called a recess. He told the War Cabinet he needed to attend a previously scheduled meeting with the Outer Cabinet, a group of 25 junior ministers who were not part of the core decision-making circle. He left the room with Halifax, still pressing for a decision, with Chamberlain still uncommitted, with the fate of the nation hanging in the balance. What Churchill did next was audacious and, some would argue, manipulative. He went upstairs to the Prime Minister's room in the House of Commons and addressed the Outer Cabinet. He had not seen most of these men since forming his government 16 days earlier. Now he told them the truth. He began by acknowledging that he had considered whether it was his duty to explore negotiations with Hitler. Then he demolished the idea with brutal clarity. He told them that any peace terms Germany offered would require disarmament, the surrender of naval bases, and the installation of a puppet government, probably under someone like Oswald Mosley, the British fascist leader. Britain would become a slave state. He told them that the nation faced a choice: fight and possibly die, or surrender and certainly lose everything worth fighting for. Then, according to Hugh Dalton, who was present, Churchill said something that electrified the room. He told them that if the Long Island story of Britain was to end, let it end only when each of them lay choking in his own blood upon the ground. The response was instant and unanimous. Ministers leapt to their feet. They surrounded Churchill, patting him on the back, shaking his hand, declaring their absolute support. Not one voice dissented. Churchill had bypassed Halifax's careful diplomacy and appealed directly to the gut-level patriotism and defiance of his colleagues. He had turned the question from a tactical debate about negotiation into a moral referendum on national survival. And he had won. Churchill returned to the War Cabinet meeting at 7 that evening. The atmosphere had changed. Halifax could sense it. Chamberlain, critically, had made his decision. When Halifax raised the Italian approach again, Chamberlain said flatly that Britain should not appear to be seeking peace terms. Any negotiations would have to wait until after the Germans failed to invade England, if they tried at all. It was a carefully phrased statement, but the meaning was clear. Chamberlain was backing Churchill. Halifax recognized that he had lost. The crisis that had threatened to bring down the government and change the course of history was over. Britain would fight. But fighting required saving the army first. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation from Dunkirk, had begun the previous evening at 6:57, when Admiral Ramsay sent the signal from his headquarters beneath Dover Castle. Initial estimates were grim. The Royal Navy believed it could rescue perhaps 45,000 men at most before German forces overran the perimeter. The plan was to use destroyers and transport ships to ferry troops from Dunkirk Harbor and the East Mole, a narrow concrete breakwater that extended into deep water. The beaches were considered too shallow for large ships to approach safely. Soldiers would have to wade out into shoulder-deep water and hope that small boats could shuttle them to the waiting vessels. It was a logistical nightmare compounded by constant German air attacks and the ever-present threat of submarines and mines. The first day of the evacuation, May 26th, was a disaster. Only 7,669 men were rescued, far below expectations. The harbor was under constant bombardment. Dive bombers screamed down on the crowded docks. Ships were hit and sank in shallow water, blocking the approaches. Soldiers waited in long lines, exhausted, hungry, many without weapons or equipment, watching the sky for the next wave of Stukas. On the beaches, men formed orderly queues that stretched hundreds of yards into the surf. They stood in the cold water for hours, waiting their turn, while German aircraft strafed the beaches with machine gun fire. The sound was deafening. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of smoke, oil, and human waste. Discipline held, barely, but the terror was palpable. On May 27th, as Churchill was outmaneuvering Halifax in London, the situation at Dunkirk deteriorated further. The port of Calais, 20 miles down the coast, finally fell after a heroic but doomed defense. The Calais garrison had been ordered to hold out to the last man to buy time for the Dunkirk evacuation. They succeeded, delaying the German advance by 3 critical days. But their sacrifice was brutal. Almost every defender was killed or captured. At Dunkirk itself, the perimeter shrank. German artillery moved within range. Shells began falling on the beaches. The evacuation accelerated, but only 7,669 men made it across the Channel that day. At this rate, the entire army would be lost. Then something unexpected happened. The weather, which had been the enemy, became an ally. On May 28th, the wind shifted. It blew from the east, carrying smoke from the burning oil refineries at Dunkirk across the beaches, creating a thick black curtain that obscured the evacuation from German observers. Low clouds rolled in, grounding the Luftwaffe. The sea remained unusually calm for late May, allowing small boats to operate in conditions that would normally have been impossible. And Hitler's decision on May 24th to halt his panzer divisions short of Dunkirk, a decision that historians still debate, gave the Allies precious time to strengthen the defensive perimeter. Whether Hitler intended this as a gesture toward a possible peace settlement, or whether his generals convinced him to preserve his armor for the coming battle for France, the result was the same. The Germans did not press their advantage, and the evacuation continued. Ramsay and his staff realized that the East Mole, originally considered too narrow and dangerous for large-scale use, could handle far more traffic than anticipated. Destroyers began docking directly against the concrete breakwater, loading hundreds of men at a time. The process was chaotic and terrifying. Soldiers scrambled aboard under fire, crowding the decks so tightly that the ships listed dangerously. German bombers targeted the mole, scoring direct hits that blasted men into the water and set ships ablaze. HMS Grenade was hit and sank. HMS Grafton was torpedoed. HMS Wakeful was cut in half by a German motor torpedo boat. 6 destroyers were lost in the first 4 days, but the evacuation continued. On May 29th, the pace accelerated. 47,000 men were rescued. Then 53,000 on May 30th. The Royal Navy had appealed for civilian assistance, and the response was extraordinary. Small boats from all over southeastern England converged on Dunkirk. Fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, river launches, lifeboats, even a paddle steamer called the Medway Queen made the crossing. Many were manned by civilian volunteers who had never been to sea in their lives. They navigated minefields, dodged air attacks, and ferried exhausted soldiers from the beaches to the larger ships waiting offshore. The Association of Dunkirk Little Ships would later identify about 850 civilian vessels that participated, though the exact number will never be known, because many simply sailed on their own initiative without official orders. The Royal Air Force fought desperately to protect the evacuation. Over 3,500 sorties were flown during the 9 days of Operation Dynamo. Spitfires and Hurricanes clashed with Messerschmitts and Stukas over the Channel. The RAF claimed to have shot down 4 German planes for every British plane lost, though the numbers were disputed and exaggerated on both sides. What mattered was that the Luftwaffe, despite its superiority in numbers, could not stop the evacuation. Hermann Göring had boasted that his Air Force alone could destroy the trapped army. He was wrong. But soldiers on the beaches, crouching under air attacks, could not see the dogfights happening miles away at high altitude. Many believed the RAF had abandoned them, and bitter accusations flew when army troops returned to England and encountered airmen in pubs. By May 31st, over 126,000 men had been evacuated. Churchill allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The miracle he had hoped for was happening, but the cost was brutal. The perimeter around Dunkirk was shrinking rapidly. Rearguard units, mostly French, were fighting desperate delaying actions to buy time for the embarkation. Ammunition was running low. Food and water were scarce. Men were collapsing from exhaustion. And every hour, the German noose tightened. On June 1st, 64,000 men were evacuated. On June 2nd, another 26,000. The beaches were littered with abandoned equipment. Trucks, artillery, tanks, motorcycles, rifles, all left behind because there was no room on the ships. The British Expeditionary Force was being saved, but it was leaving behind virtually all of its heavy equipment. Churchill understood the implications. Britain would survive, but it would take months, perhaps years, to rebuild an army capable of returning to the continent. On June 3rd, the last British soldiers were evacuated. French units continued to hold the perimeter, and thousands of French troops had already crossed the Channel. Churchill had promised the French that the evacuation would proceed on equal terms, but the reality was complicated and bitter. Many French soldiers felt abandoned. But Churchill kept his word. French evacuations continued on June 4th, even as the Germans breached the final defenses. By the time the last ship left Dunkirk, over 338,000 men had been saved. 198,000 British, 140,000 French, and a few thousand Belgian and other Allied troops. The climax came not on the beaches, but in the House of Commons on June 4, 1940. Churchill rose to address Parliament as the last soldiers from Dunkirk were still disembarking on English soil. The chamber was packed. Members knew that Churchill was about to report the results of the evacuation, and the atmosphere was tense. Would he admit defeat? Would he prepare the nation for surrender? Would he, after all the defiant rhetoric, finally acknowledge that Britain had lost? Churchill began by describing the military situation in stark, unsparing detail. He recounted the German breakthrough, the encirclement of the Allied armies, the retreat to Dunkirk. He acknowledged that the entire British expeditionary force had been at risk of capture or annihilation. He described the evacuation, the small boats, the bravery of the Royal Navy, the efforts of the Royal Air Force. And then he delivered the numbers. Over 338,000 men had been rescued, more than 10 times the number the military planners had thought possible. The House erupted in cheers. Members shouted, banged their desks, waved their papers. It was, on the surface, a triumph. But Churchill refused to let the celebration continue. He told the House that they must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars, he said, are not won by evacuations. The British Army had left behind enormous quantities of equipment: tanks, artillery, transport vehicles, ammunition, all of it now in German hands. The French were still fighting, but their situation was desperate. Britain was isolated, vulnerable, and facing the very real prospect of invasion. The entire root and core and brain of the British Army had been stranded at Dunkirk, and seemed about to perish or be captured. Their rescue was a miracle, but it was a miracle born of desperation, not strength. Then Churchill shifted from sober analysis to defiant resolve. He told the House that Britain would defend its island, whatever the cost. The speech built in rhythm and intensity, each sentence beginning with the same refrain. We shall fight. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. It was not just rhetoric. It was a promise, a threat, a declaration of intent. Churchill was telling Hitler, telling the world, that Britain would not negotiate, would not compromise, would not accept peace on any terms except total victory. And if the day came when the island was overrun and occupied, the government would carry on the fight from Canada, from the Empire, from wherever they could regroup and rebuild. The House listened in stunned silence. Some members wept openly. Others sat rigid, fists clenched. When Churchill finished, the chamber exploded in applause. Members from all parties rose to their feet. The defeatism that had permeated Westminster just days earlier was gone, replaced by something harder and more resolute. Churchill had not just reported the evacuation. He had redefined what it meant. Dunkirk was not a defeat that Britain should be ashamed of. It was a demonstration of the nation's character, its refusal to quit, its determination to survive. The speech was broadcast across the empire and reprinted in newspapers around the world. In America, still neutral, public opinion began to shift. President Franklin Roosevelt, who had been watching the crisis with increasing alarm, sent private messages of support, and quietly authorized the sale of surplus military equipment to Britain. In Germany, Hitler listened to reports of the evacuation and the speech, and reportedly complained that Churchill did not appreciate the sporting spirit Hitler had shown by refraining from creating an irreparable breach between Britain and Germany. Hitler had expected that the disaster at Dunkirk would force Britain to negotiate. Instead, it had hardened British resolve and made Churchill's position unassailable. The final numbers were staggering. 338,226 men evacuated. Approximately 1,000 ships and vessels participated in the operation, including about 700 civilian craft. 236 ships were lost, including 6 British destroyers and 3 French destroyers. Another 61 ships were damaged. The Royal Air Force lost 145 aircraft. The German Luftwaffe lost 156. For every 7 soldiers who escaped through Dunkirk, 1 man became a prisoner of war, many of them subjected to brutal treatment during forced marches into Germany. Approximately 40,000 French troops were left behind when the perimeter finally collapsed and were taken prisoner. The British Expeditionary Force had lost 68,000 men killed or captured during the entire Battle of France. But the most important number was not deaths or ships or aircraft. It was the simple fact that Britain still had an army. Battered, exhausted, stripped of equipment, but alive and capable of being rebuilt. Churchill's Gambit, his refusal to negotiate, his insistence on fighting to the end, had paid off. Britain would survive. And survival, in that dark spring of 1940, was victory enough. The immediate aftermath of Dunkirk was chaos. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers flooded into England, many still in shock, all desperate for rest, food, and reassurance. The government organized trains to disperse them across the country. Families were reunited. Newspapers published endless lists of survivors. The mood was strange, a mixture of relief and anxiety. Britain had escaped annihilation, but the threat of invasion loomed larger than ever. Churchill understood that the evacuation had bought time but solved nothing. France was collapsing. On June 22nd, just 18 days after the last troops left Dunkirk, the French government signed an armistice with Germany. Northern France came under direct German occupation. A puppet regime under Marshal Pétain governed the south. Britain now stood alone against Nazi Germany, exactly as Halifax had warned. But instead of seeking peace, Churchill doubled down. He ordered preparations for the defense of the island. Coastal defenses were strengthened. Fighter squadrons were redeployed to protect London. Plans were made to scuttle the Royal Navy rather than let it fall into German hands, if Britain was overrun. Churchill told his colleagues that if invasion came, the government would relocate to Canada and continue the war from there. The long-term legacy of Dunkirk transformed Britain's understanding of itself. The evacuation became known as the Miracle of Dunkirk, a symbol of British resilience and the spirit of improvisation under impossible circumstances. The story of the little ships, civilian volunteers risking their lives to save the army, became a cornerstone of national mythology. Dunkirk was recast not as a humiliating defeat, but as a moral victory, proof that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges. Churchill's refusal to negotiate, his decision to fight on alone, became the defining narrative of Britain's wartime experience. It validated his entire political philosophy. the belief that democracies must never appease totalitarianism, that freedom is worth any sacrifice. Historians continue to debate whether Churchill's decision was strategically sound or dangerously reckless. Some argue that he saved Western civilization by refusing to compromise with Hitler. Others point out that Britain survived largely because Hitler made critical mistakes, including the decision to halt his tanks and the failure of the Luftwaffe to destroy the evacuation. What is undeniable is that Churchill's Gambit changed the trajectory of the war. By keeping Britain in the fight through 1940 and 1941, he created the conditions for America's eventual entry and the formation of the Grand Alliance that would ultimately defeat Nazi Germany. The men who were evacuated from Dunkirk formed the backbone of the British Army that fought in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. Many of the officers who survived the evacuation rose to senior command positions. The experience of being rescued from the jaws of defeat created a sense of indebtedness and determination. These were men who had been given a second chance, and they were not going to waste it. The evacuation also demonstrated that Britain could execute complex military operations under extreme pressure, a lesson that would prove invaluable in the years ahead.
Courage, Churchill once said, is what it takes to stand up and speak. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. In the War Cabinet crisis of May 1940, Churchill demonstrated both kinds of courage. He listened to Halifax's arguments for negotiation, understood the logic behind them, and then rejected them utterly. He stood up in the face of overwhelming odds and declared that Britain would fight, even if it meant fighting alone, even if it meant dying alone. His refusal to compromise saved not just Britain, but the possibility of a free Europe. The story of Churchill's Gambit at Dunkirk is a reminder that leadership is not about having the easiest answers or the safest options. It is about making the hardest choice at the moment when it matters most. Churchill chose to risk everything rather than accept a peace that would have preserved Britain's body, but destroyed its soul. He was right. And because he was right, the world is a different place. The story of Churchill's Dunkirk decision is one of thousands that deserves to be told. If you believe true stories like this are more powerful than fiction, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below about which leader's gambit we should cover next. History is not just about the battles that were fought. It is about the decisions that shaped them. And in May 1940, one man's refusal to surrender changed everything.